A routine commercial flight within New Zealand suddenly vanishes minutes before landing. The aircraft had smashed into a mountain range, flying less than half its intended altitude. But the question was, why? At around 8:15 am on the 9th of June 1995, Ansett New Zealand Flight 703 took off from Auckland International Airport, bound for Palmerston North, a farming town in New Zealand's lower North Island. On board the de Havilland -8 100 was 18 passengers and 3 crew. Ansett was a relatively new airline, becoming only New Zealand's second major domestic airline when it began operations 8 years prior. Commanding Flight 703 was 40-year-old Captain Gary Sovereign. The first officer was 33-year-old Barry Brown. The flight attendant was 31-year-old Karen Gallagher of Christchurch. The flight time from Auckland to Palmerston North was a little over 1 hour, and the crew expected to land on runway 7, bringing them in from the west to land in an easterly direction. However, air traffic control had requested that Flight 703 instead land on runway 25. This meant they would continue south of Palmerston North and make a series of right-hand turns to line up with the runway. The final stages of the approach path would take the plane directly over the top of the northern section of the Manawatu Gorge and the Tararua mountain range. The conditions that day consisted of heavy low clouds, with little to no visibility until the final stages of the descent. At roughly 15 miles from touchdown, the pilots began their right-hand turns to cross the upcoming mountain range and beyond that, runway 25. At 9:21 am, the crew contacted air traffic control to advise they were on final. In response, the controller asked that they contact the Palmerston North Tower. However, no contact with the tower would ever be made, and at 9:22 am, Flight 703 disappeared from radar, and all attempts at communication went unanswered. Everyone's worst fears were realised when, shortly after 9:30 am, a call to 111, New Zealand's 911 equivalent, was received by someone claiming to be a passenger on Flight 703. The man stated the plane had crashed in a paddock on the side of a hill and at least 3 of the plane's 21 occupants had been killed, including the flight attendant and 2 passengers. The aircraft had crashed 16 kilometres from Palmerston North Airport on the lower foothills of the Tararua mountain range. The crash site was roughly 1,200 feet above sea level, less than half the 2,600 feet the plane should have been for that stage of the approach. So, what had gone wrong? After arriving at the scene, investigators noticed the plane's right-hand side landing gear had not been extended, while both the left-hand side and the front nose gear had been. This indicated to investigators that the pilots were having trouble with the landing gear, but didn't explain why they were less than half the required altitude for the approach stage. Although the pilots had survived the crash, both were in critical condition, and investigators were unable to speak to them for several weeks. Instead, they turned to the aircraft's flight deck data and voice recorders for answers. What they learned is as follows. At around 20 kilometres from the airport, the pilots attempted to lower the landing gear. However, when the right-hand side gear failed to extend, the captain asked the first officer to go through the appropriate checklist for a manual gear drop while he, the captain, flew the plane. Statements by the captain on the voice recorder indicated he was reluctant to abort the landing to fix the issues. Instead, he hurried the first officer through the checklist while continuing the approach. Flying over a mountain range in thick, low clouds and zero visibility, the pilots relied entirely on their instruments. However, First Officer Barry Brown was having trouble following the steps in the handbook for the manual gear drop. Captain Sovereign, still hesitant to abort the landing, began reading the handbook with him, neglecting to fly the plane. Tragically though, both pilots, preoccupied with a handbook, had failed to notice they had drifted 1,500 feet below the glide path. Moments later, at 9:22 a.m., the aircraft's ground proximity warning sounded. The pilots immediately applied full power and attempted to climb, but 4 seconds later, the plane crashed into the side of the hill. Flight attendant Karen Gallagher, who had been sitting on an armrest chatting to a passenger, was killed instantly, along with 2 other passengers. A third died of his burns 12 days later. A 139-page report highlighted the casual causes of the accident, including the faulty landing gear, the first officer's struggle with the checklist, and the reduced warning by the ground proximity alert system. But ultimately, they laid the blame on the captain for failing to fly his aircraft and maintain the correct altitude. Captain Gary Sovereign was charged with 4 counts of manslaughter. He pleaded not guilty, claiming his instruments had let him down. After what some claimed to be a coordinated effort by the pilots' union, other pilots, and even air traffic controllers to keep prosecutors from vital information, following a 6-week trial at the Palmerston North High Court, a jury found Captain Sovereign not guilty. However, while First Officer Barry Brown would go on to fly for an Air New Zealand subsidiary, neither of them would ever again fly for Ansett.
In the summer of 2021, 4 friends set out on a once-in-a-lifetime hot air balloon ride over Albuquerque, New Mexico. The captain was a licensed hot air balloon pilot with almost 2 decades of experience. However, his actions both on the ground and in the air turned what should have been a safe and unforgettable experience into a tragedy. Assistant public school principal Susan Montoya always dreamed of soaring over New Mexico in a hot air balloon. At 65 years of age, now was as good a time as any. Knowing what a big deal it was to her, her co-workers chipped in to buy her a ticket. They saw it as the perfect leaving gift when they learned she was transferring to another school. And instead of just 1 ticket, they brought her 4. Taking her 61-year-old husband, John, was an obvious choice. That left 2 spare tickets, and so their friends Mary and Martin Martinez would join them too. On the morning of Saturday, June 26, 2021, the 4 of them arrived bright and early for their hot air balloon ride over Albuquerque, New Mexico. With over 20 years of experience, their 62-year-old pilot, Nicholas Molesky, with his Cameron 0120 balloon, had earned a reputation for delivering unforgettable flight experiences. Today's flight would be unforgettable too, but for all the wrong reasons. The early portion of the flight was uneventful, and the fresh air and views out over the city of Albuquerque would have no doubt been invigorating. After around 20 minutes, they reached the city's south side and the intended area for landing. In hot air ballooning, landing is always the trickiest part, but it wasn't anything the pilot hadn't done before. However, his actions the night before would shortly have a disastrous effect. Descending toward the landing spot, Molesky failed to see the power lines near the intersection of Central Avenue and Unser Boulevard. When he did, at the last minute, spot them, he had 2 options. He could crank up the burner and hope to rise above the power lines, or, as recommended in this situation, he could open the vents for a rapid descent. Molesky chose the first option and elected to climb. Unfortunately though, the balloon rose slower than he expected, and according to eyewitnesses and surveillance footage, he may have changed his mind and tried to descend at the last minute. However, it was too late, and their fates had been sealed. At around 7:34 a.m., as shocked bystanders watched in horror, the balloon slammed into the power line, in the process cutting energy to 13,000 homes. The sudden jolt of electricity tore through the basket and envelope and severed the lines that connected them, causing the basket to plunge 100 feet onto the busy road below and burst into flames. In the immediate aftermath of the accident, after hearing what they thought were gunshots, 2 bystanders rushed to the scene. Managing to climb over the wreckage, they shut off the propane and used an extinguisher to put out the flames. However, by then, 4 of the balloon's 5 occupants were dead. The 5th would die shortly in hospital. In the aftermath of the accident, neither the NTSB nor the FAA, which had both investigated the accident, found any evidence of equipment malfunctions or failures. This meant that pilot error was to blame. Both the NTSB and the FAA concluded that pilot Nicholas Molesky had misjudged the approach and failed to maintain distance between his balloon and the lines he ultimately struck. However, that wasn't the end of the story. An autopsy showed Molesky had alcohol as well as various illicit substances in his system, which investigators believed impaired his ability to recognize the hazard, think clearly, and respond effectively and in a timely manner. The toxicologist said the results showed recent use, but not necessarily right before the accident. They were consistent with partying the night before. When his passengers set foot in the balloon that day, they could not possibly have known that he was still, at least partly, under the influence.
Now, for today's final story, a quick one from Russia. Some of the details were either missing or hard to verify, so I've stuck to the basic outline of the event. Formerly known as Leningrad and Petrograd before that, St. Petersburg in Russia is home to around 5 million people. Shaped by canals, wide boulevards, and long winters, like other major cities, it relies on a large public transport network of over 11 million daily trips. Shortly before 1 p.m. on the 10th of May 2024, around 20 commuters joined their driver, Rakhmakshuk Kurbanov, on bus number 262. Operated by West Service, bus service 262 ran approximately 9 miles through the heart of St. Petersburg, making several stops on a ride time of just over an hour. Running through the city centre is the Moika River, and it was when bus number 262 approached the Potsuliev Bridge, which crosses it, a tragedy would begin. Now, the full clip is available on YouTube, but to avoid the R18 banhammer, I'm only showing a part of it. At around 1 p.m, bus 262 with 20 passengers, driven by Rakhmakshuk Kurbanov, is caught on CCTV footage driving erratically, swerving into traffic, and colliding with 2 cars before smashing through the barrier and into the Moika River, where it sinks within seconds. While several occupants managed to get themselves out through an escape hatch, others could not. Bystanders who witnessed the chaos, without thought for their own safety, jumped into the river to help. Shaban Jabrailov, who was on his way to Friday prayers when he jumped in to help, said, "We weren't being heroes, but just fulfilling our civic duty." While most of the bus's 21 occupants, including the driver, managed to escape, either by themselves or with the help of bystanders, sadly, 3 people drowned and, unfortunately, 4 more would die later. In the immediate aftermath of the tragedy, the driver was detained and an investigation into the cause of the accident was launched. After he was interviewed, it turned out he had simply just fallen asleep and lost control. According to the Daily Mail, his wife told Russian media that her husband's manager had forced him to work the morning shift, having worked 20 hours the day before. Regardless, he was charged with negligence causing death, and police told the judge they had found him in a tired state. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to prison and banned from driving for 2.5 years. That's all the stories for today's video. Another huge thanks to my special guest, Fascinating Horror. If you haven't already, check out his channel, there's a link in the description. If you found value in today's video, I'd love it if you subscribed and joined me for the next one. To learn about an Air New Zealand plane that crashed in France, click the link on screen. And as always, thanks for watching.